I will pick this up tomorrow. All, all, all is not lost. We're hoping for a speedy decision to be made for peace.
All right. All right, let's get going. It's Monday morning, the 29th day of June, 2026. What a week we have ahead of us now. You're listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered with me, Jack Stockwell, and I will be here for the next hour rehearsing the latest. I have something I want to talk about regarding the Pope and what is happening as far as a big celebration that he's getting in Philadelphia this Friday, the day before our glorious 4th. So I kind of want to finish it with that because we need some hope right now. For those who are paying attention to what's going on, of course, that makes all the difference in the world. I've always thought there were two kinds of people on the planet, those that read and those that don't. I'm no example of scholarship by any means, but I try to read at least an hour a day from various sources of things that need to be done and need to be addressed. And one of which is, while the world is still sitting on the absolute edge of the abyss, basically the two regional wars, Ukraine and Iran, far, far, far from being settled, let alone forget what the Western media has to say to you. When you look at the situation in the Middle East, Iran, tankers that Iran said cannot go through, fired upon, two of them, two big tankers, had to turn around and come back. And as Larry Johnson was pointing out, I thought it was so cute because it always bothered me when you hear of oil tankers being accompanied by F-16s. Well, oil tankers move about 12 miles an hour on the high end when their engines are running 80 to 85% power, because they don't go over 85%. Same thing when you're flying a propellered airplane. You know where your 80% power setting is, and you don't go past that. Well, these ships are doing 12 miles an hour, and an F-16 on low cruise would be about 300 miles an hour. I don't know how they could accompany these ships. I got a laugh out of that the other day. Anyway, but it's beside the point. Two ships had to turn back. There have been something like 11 or 12 oil tankers in the last 12 hours get through the strait on the Iranian side, not the Oman, but the Iranian side, because they're going to India and China, BRICS nations. And Iran is dealing with them because the monies that they make from the sale of Iranian oil to these people and the money that they're spending did not come from any business relationships with the West. Whereas all the other tankers that are sitting there north of the strait, just sitting there, waiting for something to be solved, the ones that are holding crude, the ones that are holding the mid-range stuff, the ones that are holding the helium, the ones that are holding the sulfur, the ones that are holding the fertilizer, are just sitting there waiting to get through because they deal with the West. And because they deal with the West, Iran's going to shoot them out of the water. So who's won this war? The base at Bahrain has been all but totally destroyed. Of the 28 bases that were up and operating before February 28th of this year, when the straits were wide open to everybody. More than half of them totally destroyed, but the latest attack on Bahrain, there's nothing left. And the only thing the U.S. armed forces can do right now, if they really want to do this memorandum of understanding, which looks like it's pretty well dead in the water, because the next major war is about to break out any hour, any day. The best thing the U.S. can do right now is pull out. Pull out before there's more deaths. The mounting deaths must be in the hundreds by now of American servicemen and seamen. The ships that are headed to dock in the U.S. for repairs, because some of them are barely floating. The things that do not make it onto Western media, because Western media is still pretty well controlled by MI6 and the CIA and those other forces that are pretty much behind what's going on there. And so it looks like we're in for another round of open warfare, and the United States knows that they've lost the first one because the straits are closed. If we had won the first round, the straits would be open. But the United States lost the first round. The second round, as I said, could begin at any time. And then that brings us to the Ukraine. Now, I'm going to go into further detail in both of these, but with the Ukraine, you've got President Trump at the G7 telling Zelensky, go for it. And at the G3, I don't know if it's G3 or not, but Germany, France, and Great Britain, a week before the G7, have all committed to one another to get all of the parts that they can get together for all of the missiles that they can, missile parts, cruise missiles, attack missiles, long distance missiles, whatever else, that they're using against the Russian the civilians. You don't see the Russians doing that to the Ukraine. Right now, the Russians every day are taking out every gas station they can find, sending a small drone into every gas station they can find in the Ukraine. But they're not attacking anything else but offensive targets. Of course, there is some collateral now and then, but for the most part, I think that's about to change. So President Trump tells Zelensky, go for it. And Zelensky, of course, is telling everybody, we need all of the money, we need all the support, we need all the missiles we can get, because we're winning the war against Russia. Russia, of course, continues to advance daily. And from what I can pick up from the sources that I listen to, and I try to listen to both sides, the Russian generals are getting very upset with Putin. They support him because he's the commander-in-chief, but they're getting very upset that Putin has waited and waited and waited till this day before he does anything more drastic than what he's already done. The Duma, many members of the Duma, and they've got some elections coming up, want to finish it off. These Russian generals want to finish it off. And so when you hear Germany and France and Great Britain saying, we're going to up the game, you see the social aspects of these countries' budgets being cut way, way, way back so they can increase their military budgets. Because I think they really believe they're going to be at war with Russia by 2029, if not sooner. And so they have increased, as I said a few minutes ago, the importation into Ukraine of these parts to be assembled in the Ukraine. And some of these are getting nasty. Some of these rockets, these missiles, are a bit more nasty than Tomahawks or the Shadow. And so Russia is aware of all of this. And Lavrov, in his mild diplomatic way, is saying, we know this, we hear this, we see this. But Putin has said just last week, and I don't know, but this might be the first time Putin ever said this. He said, we're ready. We're ready now with war, for war with Europe. We're ready. Now they've demonstrated what kind of missiles they have. We know that the Oreshnik is a hybrid. The Oreshnik can carry nukes, as well as the kinetic weapons they carry. And so, as of last week, Russia said, we're ready. Lavrov said, we know what you're doing. We know where you're doing it. We hear this. We see these things. And then, of course, the West is saying, we're preparing for war by 2029 with Russia. I don't think it's going to go that long. Now, I want to talk about what's going on in the Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East, because these have an immediate impact on me and my grandchildren. I think there's something like 2 weeks left of strategic oil reserves. 2 weeks. What's going to happen before July's over with at the gas pumps? And not just the gas pumps. You see what Tim, what's his name, the CEO of Apple. All their equipment is going up several $100s. The new iPhones are going up $200 a piece because the chips that need helium. There's a portion of the manufacturing of these computer chips that cannot be done in any atmosphere that is the least bit reactive until they're covered over with silicon. And they have to be completely insulated. Well, you can't do it in a vacuum, so they do it in a helium-rich atmosphere. Because helium, unless you've got the temperatures of the center of the sun, is a rather inert gas. It can change in a plasma state, but we don't really have that naturally occurring on this planet. And so we're going to be out of helium, and it's not just Apple products that are going to go through the ceiling. It's not just diesel prices that are going to go through the ceiling. That's going to affect everything, let alone food prices. And President Trump tells Zelensky, go for it. Now, in the Ukraine, Europeans in general, I think one has to note, I would say, a subtle but not so completely subtle shift that is coming from Lavrov, as I was saying earlier, who I believe is a very seasoned diplomat. He may be the foremost diplomat on the planet. We don't have any in America. We just have a bunch of big mouth braggarts. Bomb, bomb, bomb Iran. Bomb, bomb, bomb Russia. And therefore, when someone like Lavrov comes forth and actually makes statements in the area of which I'm speaking, he should be listened to with great care and clarity. Because he just had a meeting with ambassadors and diplomats from around the world where he made two very important points. One is that he said, looking into the policies of the US, the UK, and Europe, one has to note that they're striving for complete world dominance. No big revelation, we know that. Lavrov, we appreciate that observation. And he said that they want to continue to basically live by the privileges that they've done so far to exact the resources from all over the world and live at the expense of others. And he says Russia is trying to counter that by proposing a new security structure for the world. And the outcome of that conflict will decide the future of the world. The outcome will decide the future of the world. Well, I can only agree with that because for the 32 years I've been on the radio, been trying to promote a new security architecture for this planet. Now, Lavrov made another extremely important point in his representation of Russia before these ministers. And that is that he thinks that the United States, meaning Trump, of course, in particular, has stopped trying to be an honest broker in the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, as it had been discussed a year ago in Anchorage. And what I hear from other sources is that the Anchorage thing is all but dead, that it was a stalling procedure, just like the Maidan, in order to rearm the Ukraine. And he said that listening to what Brussels is saying, London, Rome, Paris, Berlin, is basically the demand for the unconditional surrender of Russia and unlimited military support for the Ukraine, especially Kyiv, of course. And it's clear that when Lavrov said this, that they want to keep Ukraine as a launching pad for their fight against Russia. And he said that Trump and Anchorage expressed very clearly that there needs to be a lasting peace in Ukraine, that it's of no use to have a ceasefire, which then erupts into new wars a few weeks or months or years after that. And then he says that the line has vanished because the deputy UN representative of the United States is now just demanding an immediate ceasefire in the Ukraine, which is exactly what the Europeans and the Ukrainians are demanding, without consideration for a lasting peace, which would only be possible if you remove the root causes of the crisis, which, among other things, is NATO's expansion to the east. So Lavrov said that while reflecting on that, he says he doesn't even want to think about what that implies, that Trump has given up the role of mediator. And one cannot help then to have the suspicion that the Anchorage experience was just an attempt to gain time for the Ukraine, as were so many other of the European initiatives regarding this conflict. Now, that's a very serious change in the way that Russia is speaking about this, because in the whole period since Anchorage, a lot of people, including myself for that matter, had a certain hope that the agreement between Putin and Trump would lead to some form of stability, which somehow could hold even if the coalition of the willing, the big three, and a few other countries, would go ahead and continue to push with their war drive. Now, if the Russians, who have been very patient and repeated many times their trust in Trump, are now changing that line, then from the Russian point of view, it's for a very good reason. And I think it's a very serious worsening of the situation, given the very lively debate that's going on in Russia right now in the media, a lot of which there are English translations. And on Russian TV, where a lot of the people are discussing what Russia has left to do to stop this continuous European provocation and the sending of European missiles, regardless of their source, including America, into Russian civilian areas. And some people in the media were saying Russia is damned if they do, damned if they don't, meaning if they do something to send a signal to the West that they're not basically taking the crossing of these red lines any longer, but fearing at the same time that if they do, then the West is going to say, aha, Russia's striking. Russia's the aggressor, not us. And if they do it, then the incursions deep into the territory of Russia continue. And it's creating some serious problems in terms of infrastructure in the Crimea right now. Even among dormitories of students and other real civilian institutions that are being hit by Western drones. So I'm somewhat concerned that if there is such a change in that perception that Lavrov is insinuating, that would cut out any last change in the perception of any anchors remaining of potential stability between these countries. And if the Russian assessment is that Trump is as treacherous as Merkel and Hollande were, when they admitted that they were in terms of the Minsk II agreement was just a dodge to arm the Ukraine, I think this represents a major worsening of the strategic situation. Because the implication coming out of Russia has, for the last couple of years or so, or maybe longer, is that we're working with the Americans, and now, after what Trump said at the G7, Zelensky, you can go for it. Just go for it. With what? Anyway, the other aspect of what Lavrov has said is that the U.S. is trying, together with the UK and Europe, to dominate the resources and the energy resources of the world. And in particular, he mentioned Venezuela and Iran. Now, it's very clear that this was the initial consideration why the United States joined Israel in the Iran war. I mean, Trump had said at one point, when we go in there, we're going to control their entire oil. Now, this wasn't something he just thought of in the middle of the night to say the next day when asked by the press, why are you attacking Iran? Well, at one point he said, we're going to go in there and control their oil. Why did we go into Venezuela? So we had a kind of a jungle paradise to run off to when it got too cold here in the wintertime? No, we went there to control their oil. Now, the United States has lost the war in Iran. You can't argue that anymore. It's over with at this point. When the Iranian army and the IRGC, those are two different things, destroyed Bahrain, the Fifth Fleet base at Bahrain, destroyed, not attacked, destroyed. And nothing's happened since. Who has the upper hand? And from what we have learned, we haven't seen the worst of what Iran can launch. Now, that does not mean that the geopolitical manipulations are not continuing, the latest of which was the Foreign Secretary of State, Rubio, traveling to Bahrain, to Qatar, to Kuwait, trying to basically prevent any agreement, for example, between Iran and Oman to jointly manage the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz by not demanding a fee, but demanding some kind of payment for maintenance or whatever the formulation of this supposed agreement they're trying to come to. So Rubio obviously seems to have put pressure on the government of Oman because their foreign minister said, no, we don't want a fee. And then Agrachi, immediately when he hears this, calls the foreign minister of Oman and says, yeah, we're going to have a joint agreement. There's a lot back and forth and reflecting the fact that unfortunately this thing isn't settled at all. And one touching point is what actually is the arrangement between these two countries on the Strait of Hormuz. Now think about that for a second. Who won this war? Iran and Oman are sitting there Well, they're not sitting there, figuratively speaking. They're deciding on how they're going to control the strait and what they're going to get in return for it, because there's a lot of reparations that both countries are looking for, especially Iran. And that they're going to supposedly use this money for reparations to rebuild what the West has destroyed. Now, who won the war if Iran and Oman are having these discussions? Because if the West had won it, then the West would be there charging ships. America, Trump, and his two real estate agents would be over there charging admission through the straits, holding Iran at bay. And even much bigger, naturally, is the question of what Trump is going to do about Israel, which formerly withdrew from southern Lebanon, but insists on keeping the so-called security zone. And apparently the killing is continuing, the attacks are continuing. So reportedly, the situation in Israel is extremely panicked, because at least some people in Israel are realizing that this present course of Israeli policy may not really be in the best security interest of Israel. Because if you make so many enemies that everybody starts to hate you, you may not be on the smartest line of thinking as far as international relations are concerned. It may not be the smartest thing to do. And on the other side, you have the radical elements like Ben-Gvir, who basically in his last public speeches, let all Lebanon burn, let it all burn down to the ground. And we will never get out of there, he said. So that situation is unresolved, and it could only be resolved if President Trump would impose some kind of control over the Netanyahu government, which he doesn't seem to be prepared for, or even, whatever the reason is. And we could argue about that for half an hour. But in any case, this is not yet a settled question either. So, where's this leave us? You know, that at any day, any hour, this conflict continues. There's this time bomb ticking of the world plunging into an economic depression with a financial system about to blow out. Now, the present policies of the West are basically to go for unparalleled militarization, massive military buildup, which is demanding more and more billions practically every week, and the military industrial complex in all of its tentacles around this planet just salivating to the point where their poisonous spew is running down the front of their mouths, dripping onto their clothes as they rub their hands for the amount of money they're making with all this talk of increased militarization. And who can compete with the biggies? The U.S. is now demanding another $87 billion for the Iran war, the war that we've lost. And the U.S. the military is demanding another $87 billion. In Europe, you have the military build-up policies while their economies are collapsing. Just insane. At Volkswagen, for example, one of the key brands of the German economic prosperity for decades, they're now laying off, they just announced it, 100,000 people. Likewise, layoffs are, just think of the automobile industry in America. If General Motors and Ford and Chrysler and of domestic brands were to announce 100,000 manufacturing layoffs, would you feel that? Would you be aware of that? Would you hear that? Well, in Germany, Volkswagen alone, which is a particular section of their GDP, has just announced the layoffs of 100,000 people. Likewise, layoffs are occurring right and left in other industries supportive of the automobile industry in Germany. and the number of insolvencies is escalating. And their only answer is military buildup. And now it's quite amazing that the truth is coming out that this is a policy. This is in the German press. This policy of militarization. Where's the money going to come from for this? Well, they're cutting back on their social programs, but they can only cut back so far because they need hundreds of billions of euros in order to fund this militarization in Germany alone. And so the truth, this policy, this openly modeled policy of Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's financier, because Mark Carney of Canada and Luc Frieden, the Prime Minister of mighty Luxembourg, had an op-ed in the Financial Times this last week in which they demanded the rapid creation of a new multilateral bank in the transatlantic financial system, basically to finance military buildup. Now, just think of that. Are any of you in economic stress? Any of you going week to week with your paycheck? If you don't get a paycheck this next week, you're going to be in trouble. You know, my doors are open to new patients all the time and follow-up patients. But if they stop coming in, I'm going to be in financial stress. So the possibility of you not having a job by August 1st, why don't we get together and create a new bank? This is what they're doing. You and I get together, we sit down over, you know, some lemonade and a hot dog or hamburger or something, and figure out how. Let's just create a new bank, and then we can fund our losses by loans from this bank. So in case I have to close my doors, or you have to find another job in a market where it's very soft on new employees, you might be having to do the kinds of jobs that PhD immigrants end up doing in sanitation or whatever, when they come here with PhD degrees in engineering, science, medicine, whatever else, and they've got to be a janitor at a high school because nobody will hire them. You could find yourself in that situation. You may think I'm being extreme, but hopefully I'm being extreme. I may have to close my doors because people can't afford me, and what I charge is necessary to keep my doors open. So why don't we create a bank? Because that's what they're doing, and that's what they're trying to do in Germany. Mark Carney of Canada. And so they're going to create a multilateral bank in the Atlantic or the transatlantic financial system, basically to finance the military buildup that they need because they don't have the euros to spend on it. Just like if we had an economic setback, we wouldn't have the dollars to keep food on the table. So let's create a bank. That's exactly what Hjalmar Schacht did in the 1930s with his MEFO bills. You create money out of thin air to finance a war machine. But then as these monies become due, the pressure to actually resolve it with war then is increasing, because that would forestall the payment of the loans, which you don't have the money to pay anyway. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You create a bank, create money out of thin air, buy your weapons, increase your militarization. And why would you create the militarization? For war. And so you end up having war to forestall or cancel the loans. A great business idea. They claim that NATO needs an additional 850 billion euros per year for the military buildup they need to conquer Russia. Now that would go into hyperinflation. It'll be the death blow to the financial system because this does not go into the real economy. This goes into the destruction of real assets that are used as collateral because military production is not part of the real economy. Military production in our country is not part of the real economy. You don't find military in the Dow. You find service companies. It's a part of the waste economy. Now, fortunately, that's not the only game in town. There's a totally different dynamic going on. Very importantly, the German government, we just read this over the weekend. The German government is now pushing, they say at first it'll be voluntary, but they have sent out questionnaires to 300,000 people, German citizens, in the age range where they can join the military. I'm not sure what that is, but it probably starts around 18. I don't know how high it goes. But the males were required to fill out this survey if they don't want to have a fine, you know, and it's to fill out these questionnaires if they might like to join the army, what they would think about that, if they're fit for the German army, and things like that. So concerning the boys, 96% sent the questionnaire back. Of the 300,000 that were boys, 96% of them answered the questionnaire and sent it back. Only 4% of the girls did, because the girls weren't required to fill it out, but they got a questionnaire anyway. It was all voluntary on the part of the girls. But you know how many people said, and this was published, of the 96% of the boys that answered the questionnaire, what percentage of them said they would be interested in joining the army? 300,000 were asked. 340, not 1,000, 340 boys said, yeah, they'd like to join the army. That amounts to 0.18%. Not even a quarter of 1%. So less than 2% of the German young men want to join the army, and I think that's a very hopeful sign, and only 4% of the girls even bothered to answer the questionnaires. Now, that doesn't yet make it policy in Germany, but it's a hopeful sign that some people realize that they don't want to be cannon fodder in a war which can only be lost, because how do you win a war against the strongest nuclear power on the planet, which is Russia? And they have, I just heard from a very good source, I think it was yesterday or Saturday, that Russia has instituted the dead hand. The dead hand has already been done. You remember the dead hand? On launch against Russia of nuclear devices, automatically a response will be launched. And it won't take somebody to do it. The program will do it. And then there's the 2-week dead hand. The 2 weeks after the nuclear exchange. Who knows how many more missiles will be launched from Russia around the world 2 weeks later. Now, I would call that a reason not to attack Russia. So naturally, you have this overwhelming majority, the Global South, the BRICS countries, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There was just a meeting between Russia and these countries in Kazan, where they all discussed the new security and developmental architecture, basically offering that it's open to any country that wants to join, and therefore there is an alternative that's on the table here. The only thing which would be necessary to end this whole insanity would be for the countries of the West, the European countries, even our mighty United States, to say, you know, I think as we stop these geopolitical efforts to control this planet, let's just cooperate on a partnership level. And they would be received with open arms into these new institutions. Now, as what was discussed, as far as further military, the things that Anchorage tried to avoid, and concerning the perception of Russia about the Anchorage dynamic not being there anymore, and Lavrov even putting into question if it ever was meant seriously in the first place. As I said, he said in this recent speech with diplomats that he doesn't even want to think about it. But it could be that the whole Anchorage thing was planned, like a deception, like the Europeans had done with their other initiatives, as I said, with the cheating on the Minsk II process. Now, if there is no change, I kind of share the concern with some of you that have sent me emails that there is going to be some kind of a reaction here in the coming days, maybe an Oreshnik on a plant of the Taurus missiles or some other production of these weapons in countries outside of the Ukraine. And I also think that we're heading towards an absolute crisis point in terms of the economic situation and how that relates to the financial situation, like the false oil prices. The availability of oil is dropping all across this planet because of what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz. But have you seen the oil prices? They're going down. Now, when you have a shortage of something, prices usually go up, but the oil futures are going down even with decreasing amounts of oil availability. Yeah, it's all manufactured. It's all fraud. And so I think we're headed for some kind of crisis in the sense of this economic situation and how it relates to the overall finances of this planet. But you could have a blowout of the financial system, and in the worst of all cases, you could have a coincidence of the two in the sense that you have an escalation on the military side, and then a blowout of the financial system, which would be a moment where all bets are off. Everything is unclear on what could happen if we go to World War III, or if we can avoid it. So it seems to me we have not yet come up with a necessary remedy to that, because it seems that no matter as much as these policies are clearly failing, I mean, the war against Iran has failed, the situation with Ukraine is a disaster after 4 years, but the elites are completely unwilling to make any correction of policies which propelled us into this dilemma. To the contrary, it seems that they are increasing their efforts to control the narrative, to make sure that there is no organized resistance, no democratic change. And so it's at a point where some saner heads are necessary. Now, I want to make some comments about Pope Leo XIV, and how much time he got, and his encyclical Magnificat Humanitas, and how he contrasts the future of mankind to the Tower of Babel. And the story from the Bible where this community of people attempt to create this tower that'll reach to the heavens to where God is. And then they find themselves in a quarreling with one another to where God is, and they find themselves speaking all these different languages, and they all run off in different directions. Now, the Pope contrasts that to the mission of Nehemiah. You remember the Old Testament prophet who was to restore the city of Jerusalem, particularly rebuilding the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And the Pope asked the question to us today, what kind of builders are we? So he's asking this in the context of taking an extended look at artificial intelligence and the prospects for that technological advance being used for good as being used for ill purposes. But it's really that it allows for the presentation both to the Catholic Church but also to humanity as a whole, this idea concerning the dignity of human beings, which this encyclical eloquently defends. I mean, it's the same idea that exactly this 4 days that's going to be celebrated in the city of Philadelphia this Friday, hopefully throughout the United States, but perhaps much of the world, when we will see the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, which essentially was the spiritual birth of the United States of America. Technically, America didn't really exist as a government for another decade with the ratification of the Constitution, but still, July 4th is the spiritual birth of our country. And the revolutionary process that resulted in the creation of this country, had actually been going on for over 150 years, from 1620 when they showed up on the American shores. And as John Adams and others of the founders have pointed out, it was not the military engagement of 7 years, which was the American Revolution. It was the process that led to the point that independence was actually declared. What led up to that? That was the spirit of America. And this was, of course, something that Benjamin Franklin had very much pioneered, but it became the intellectual property of everyone in America that identified with that cause, which was about a third of the population. And once it was written down and then proclaimed in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, the other cities, it became the manifest intention of at least 1/3 of the people in the American colonies, including the enslaved populations of the American colonies. There were back at that time, at the time of 1776, 3.5 million people in the colonies. 500,000 of them were African, enslaved largely, but in a portion, some of them free in the northern states. That's a higher percentage of the people of African descent than we have here in America today. So it's important to recognize that, and I'll just point it out, that the Pope will be receiving on the 3rd of July, this Friday, in 6 days, a special Liberty Award, which will technically be given by Villanova University and will lead to a speech by the Pope, which will be simulcast and hosted in Independence Hall. I think it's like 11 a.m. Eastern Time this Friday. Now, so what? Well, his encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, or the Magnificence of Humanity, and on safeguarding the human person in the time of artificial intelligence. I think that was the rest of it. Now, just to illustrate why and for how long matters concerning the relationship between your identity as a human being and human learning and the intrusion, attack, whatever else, by the machines have been particularly controversial. There was this article that came out in 2015. It was called this: Screen Time versus Playtime, What Tech Leaders Won't Let Their Own Kids Do. And the first paragraph of that article said this: when a technology journalist suggested to Steve Jobs in 2010 that his children must have loved the just released iPad, he replied flatly, "Oh, they don't use it. We limit how much technology our kids use at home." And his former right-hand man, Jonathan Ive, whose design for the iPad was so simple that toddlers could use it, because I see toddlers using them in my clinic, said that he set strict limits for his 10-year-old twin boys. So in other words, the people that made the technology were not letting their kids use it. And then the article went on to reference the fact that many of them had their children in special schools. Now, this is something that's rather recent. The data released in 2024. It says that 1 out of 4 children owned their own cell phone by the age of 8, and that 51% of children 8 or younger have their own smartphone or tablet, and it has various other statistics. I just wanted to point out those two. Then the final one is that the percentage of 5 to 8-year-olds who used an app or device that taps into artificial intelligence to learn about school-related materials was 39% in 2024. 5 to 8-year-olds. 39% of 5-year-olds to 8-year-olds were using information tapping into artificial intelligence. So the point is that one of the largest experiments in behavior in human history has been conducted for the past 15 years, since the advent in particular of the iPad, and with the iPhone additionally, which the iPhone came out, I think, three years later. So what we've been living through is this transformation that has been completely unregulated. Once the devices are there, the idea content begins to flow, the imagery begins to flow into these developing minds and psyches, and the impact, including on children 12 years and older, that was avoided intensively by the people who created these devices, has now become standard, particularly in our country. And matter of fact, it tends to indicate the children who are poorer may be better off for a lack of having this kind of unregularized, specific access to this technology. That would be an interesting thing to see how that may or may not affect the world as a whole. But in his upcoming papal encyclical, I want to quote the Pope's words on a few concerns that he had in all of this that I thought was particularly important. This is from section 98. It is appropriate to preface this discussion with 2 considerations. First, any statement regarding AI risks becoming quickly outdated, given the remarkable pace at which these systems are developing. Second, all of us, including those who designed them, possess only a limited understanding of their actual functioning. Indeed, current AI systems are more cultivated than built, for developers do not directly design every detail, but instead create a framework within which the intelligence grows. As a result, fundamental scientific aspects, such as the internal representations and computational processes of these systems, remain at present unknown. There thus emerges an urgent need for a twofold commitment. On the one hand, a deepening of scientific research. On the other hand, the exercise of moral and spiritual discernment. Imagine the Pope talking about stuff like this. Then he said this: it's not possible to provide a single comprehensive definition of AI. What can be stated, however, is that we must avoid the misconception of equating this type of intelligence with that of human beings. These systems merely imitate certain functions of human intelligence. Now, of course, you probably will know that we've heard something very different concerning all of this. But the Pope says this: in doing so, they must surpass human intelligence in speed and computational capacity, offering tangible benefits across many fields. Yet this power remains entirely tied to data processing. So-called artificial intelligences do not undergo experience. They do not possess a body. They do not feel joy or pain. They do not mature through relationships. They do not know from within what love, work, friendship, or responsibility mean. Nor do they have moral conscience, since they do not judge good and evil, and they grasp the ultimate meaning of situations or bear responsibility for consequences. They may imitate language, behavior, and analytical skills, or even simulate empathy and understanding, but they do not understand what they produce for the lack of effective, relational, spiritual perspective through which human beings grow in wisdom. Even when these tools are described as capable of learning, their way of doing so is different from that of the human person. It is not the experience of those who allow themselves to be shaped by life and grow over time through choices, mistakes, forgiveness, and fidelity. Rather, it's a form of statistical adaptation based on data and feedback, which can be very effective but doesn't imply inner growth. This is really good. There's a lot more here, but I don't have time to go into the rest of it, maybe tomorrow. But I just, when this celebration that's coming up next Saturday, the 4th of July, and I'll probably talk more about this tomorrow, where this document came from, because it would be a mistake to think, as with the Declaration of Independence, that there's a single author. Obviously, many people have thought that for many years, such as that, well, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. That's not true. Jefferson was the draftsman who wrote the Declaration of Independence. There was this committee of 5 who were putting all of these things together that Jefferson, acting as a draftsman, put together. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson were the composers. And there were many drafts. The one there in the archive in Washington, D.C. is not the original. There was a lot of discussion. Jefferson was the person that was assigned the actual writing of the conclusions of this group of 5. But in the course of the weeks that led up to the 4th of July, that committee re-examined every constitution of every nation that had existed up to that time in the planet that was accessible to them at that date. And the discussions that are contained therein reflect that. So, well, it looks like we're out of time. Maybe I can get into more of this tomorrow. I'm not taking anything away from Jefferson. I think it's important to understand that he was the draftsman. He didn't sit there and come up with when in the course of human events. That was after several drafts of this committee of 5. Anyway, I'm off to work. I'm very excited for the people that I'm going to see and be able to take care of today. I've only got so much energy left. I can only work so hard. And then poof, it's like somebody turned off the switch. But I will be there today taking care of the people that I can. I'm going to end the recording and save it. And for those of you on the stream, again, I greatly appreciate if you can like and subscribe. That's what increases the numbers. Just want to point that out to you. But thank you for your fidelity. I appreciate it.